Welcome to In the Funnel. My name is Mark Cox. In the Funnel is a group of sales coaches and consultants that help B2B sales teams dramatically improve revenue. Clients come to us when revenue growth has stagnated, or their sales team is not meeting expectations, or they need to recalibrate their sales and go-to-market plan for the upcoming year. Our clients have enjoyed tremendous success working within the funnel, and please hear it straight from them by listening to the testimonial section of this website. What they'll tell you is there's two things that make us unique and different in our space. Number one, we have a process and a methodology. First, for understanding your current state, and then second, for building your sales and go-to-market plan for the upcoming year. The second thing that makes us unique and different is that everybody within the funnel has run a material sales organization in their recent past. We're all practitioners. We don't have any theorists or teachers, and what that means is we can get in front of your sales team and run the next sales meeting, or join them on their next sales call to close your next large prospect. All of us have a passion for professional, disciplined, process-driven sales, and we'd be delighted to talk to you if you're looking to grow revenue for your company. Please feel free to reach out to us through this website at info@inthefunnel.com or by telephone. Thanks for taking the time to watch this.
I've become a strong proponent of a different approach to strategy than most traditional companies pursue. And it comes from my experience working with some of the most successful tech companies in Silicon Valley. They have an approach to strategy that I've come to call zoom out, zoom in. And what I mean by that is they focus on two different time horizons in parallel. One time horizon, 10 to 20 years. Zoom out. And the questions on that horizon are, what is our relevant market or industry going to look like 10 to 20 years from now? And what's a really big opportunity that could be much larger than anything we've ever done before?
Oh, great.
So that's the zoom out. Zoom in is different horizon, 6 to 12 months. And on that horizon, the questions are, what are the 2 or 3 initiatives, no more, that we could pursue over the next 6 to 12 months that would have the greatest impact in accelerating our movement towards that longer term opportunity?
Oh, great.
And do we have a critical mass of resource against those 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? And how would we measure progress? And so it's an interesting balance of zoom out, long-term opportunity, but short-term action and impact.
Hey team, that's John Hagel. And John has just had an amazing career. After graduating with an MBA in Harvard and a law degree, he actually went into consulting with BCG and McKinsey, Deloitte, where he founded a research center called the Center for the Edge, which we'll talk about. He's worked with dozens of startups. He's been working in Silicon Valley for over 40 years. Just an amazing story for John Hagel. With all of that amazing background in strategy and consulting, I was so surprised that someone like that wrote a book about fear. But that's what we're going to talk about here today. The Journey Beyond Fear. Leverage the 3 pillars of positivity to build your success. That's what we're going to speak about today with John. And a couple of things we're going to talk about is, what is fear? Very close match, by the way, in my view, between fear and excitement. We'll talk about why people are experiencing so much fear these days, professionally and personally. It's very justified. We'll understand how that manifests itself in terms of someone's view of the future. Do they see the future as a threat, or do they see a future as an opportunity? And of course, that changes everything. As leaders, we're going to talk about how do we create an environment corporately where we actually can engage our workforce so they're not feeling that fear. Much of this has to do with the corporate narrative about the future and about our clients, and also our personal narratives as people. This is just a wonderful conversation with John today. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure you will too. And if you do, please like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast. Tell your friends. Here's John Hagel. Hey, John, thank you so much for joining the Selling Well podcast. It's a real honor to have you on the show today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So today, John, we're hoping to talk about primarily the journey beyond fear as one of the main topics of discussion. But one of the reasons I was so excited to speak to you today was when I take a look at all of your credentials, and you've been with BCG, you've been with McKinsey, you've been involved in so many different startups. You were with Deloitte, where you created and ran the Center for the Edge, which we'll talk about. But with those strategic credentials, you're one of the best business minds in the world on strategy. What prompted you to write a book about fear?
Well, it took a while, but it was basically the experience that I had as a strategist working with leaders of companies and large organizations around the world. And over time, I began to realize that, unless you really focus on the emotions of the people that are involved, the best strategy is just going to sit on a shelf somewhere, and it's never going to be implemented or acted on. And so over time, I became more and more focused both on the emotions of the leaders, but also on the emotions of the people who are in the organization, to understand what's driving their choices and actions. And if it's not the right emotions, how can we evolve those emotions so that we'll get more impact from whatever strategy is being proposed or implemented? And so that was, it took a long time, because my training was always strategy is it. Once you have the best strategy, you win. And I've come to believe that over time, it's less about strategy and more about psychology.
So, John, let's unpack that a little bit. So it's less about strategy, and it's more about the emotions of the people executing on the strategy. And so, of course, the book that we're going to talk about today, The Journey Beyond Fear, leverage the 3 pillars of positivity to build your success. Obviously, fear is one of those driving emotions that you're referencing. Can we start by defining it? I've always, for myself, playing sports or professionally, I've always seen my physical reaction to both fear and excitement seem to be very close.
Yeah.
So how do we define fear for those listening?
Yeah, I'll say too that the catalyst for the book, I started writing it 5 or 6 years ago now. And I was traveling around the world as part of my work, and everywhere I went, the dominant emotion that I was encountering was fear, at the highest levels of organizations, at the lowest levels, out in the communities. And specifically to your question, when I talk about fear, what I'm talking about is fear of the future. What is your emotion as you look into the future? Is it primarily viewing threat and being afraid, or is it viewing opportunity and being excited? Mm-hmm. And I think to your point, many people say, well, fear is a good thing. It motivates people to act. I would say it's a good thing if it's in the moment. If you're being confronted by a lion right in front of you, mm-hmm. Yes, you will be afraid, and you will act in a very positive and surviving way. The problem with fear of the future is it's not facing you right this minute. It's out there in the future. Mm-hmm. And in that context, I believe fear becomes a very limiting emotion, in the sense that it shrinks your time horizons. Number one, you start to just focus on the present because you can't be distracted by the future. It's too scary. You end up becoming more risk averse, unwilling to take risk, because the future is going to, be very threatening. And you lose trust in others. If you're confronting threats in the future, you may seem like a nice person, but I just can't afford to depend on you in going forward into the future. So you become more isolated, and that all becomes very limiting. I mean, that actually increases the potential threat because you're isolated, you're lacking trust, and you're not even looking ahead to try to anticipate what you need to do. So, yeah.
So it's so interesting hearing you share this because, one of the privileges we have of our business that we run, which is called In the Funnel, we're sales coaches and consultants, but we end up working a lot with entrepreneurs, of mid-size organizations. And you talked about at the beginning of that response, you were talking about the difference between viewing something, as a threat or viewing something as an opportunity. And it's amazing to me working with these entrepreneurs because they view almost everything as an opportunity and they're extremely future oriented. So and they're way out there, not trying to get through this week or next week or, the lion in front of us, but they're future oriented. Was some of this perspective that you've gained? I know you've spent almost 5 decades, 4.5 decades in Silicon Valley. Did you have that same experience working with the entrepreneurs over the last 4 decades?
Definitely. I mean, it's one of the things that drew me to Silicon Valley was the sense of optimism among the entrepreneurs and the people here. They look into the future and they see opportunity, and it's exciting for them. It's not scary. There's, there's some fear because they know they're going to take some risk and, things may not go as planned. But their primary emotion is a very specific form of passion. I call it the passion of the explorer. And I think that passion is what motivates them to really take huge risks, bring people together, not just do it, by themselves, and, pursue the opportunities that are exciting.
Well, I've had an opportunity to listen to you on a variety of different podcasts and a number of different speeches, and that energy and enthusiasm, that you provide on this topic, absolutely contagious.
Yeah.
And my background, John, was I did spend time in large corporate environments running sales organizations prior to becoming an entrepreneur and running the company I run now, which I've done for about 9 years. And the joy of doing what I do now is both in my company and with the clients we work with, there is that passion, that enthusiasm, that optimism. Entrepreneurs sort of have that in their DNA. They're future oriented and they see the opportunities. I'll say in my past corporate life, which I also enjoyed for many long periods, but this was definitely the journey for me. But in my corporate life, I absolutely came across far more people who were dealing with fear. And, whether you called it politics or fear, every meeting seemed to be rife with folks who were uncertain about what was going to take place. They were worried about their positioning, a lot of fear. Has that been your experience? It seemed to me that in the corporate world, there was an enormous amount of this fear you're speaking of. I'm sure you've done some research. What percentage of people are dealing with this kind of fear on a regular basis?
No, I can't quantify it in percentage terms, but again, that was the catalyst for me to write the book. Was everywhere I went, that was the dominant emotion. And this was not just in the US, this was around the world. So
wow.
It's not limited to a specific country or industry. I think it's widespread. And I will hasten to say that I think it's understandable as an emotion because, again, based on research that I've done, I've looked at the long-term forces that are reshaping the global economy. And I believe we're in the early stages of what I call the big shift. A fundamental transformation of our economy and society. And it has many different dimensions to it, but one dimension is mounting performance pressure. In this big shift, competition is intensifying on a global scale. Pace of change is accelerating. Things we thought we could count on are no longer there. And as if that weren't enough, because of all the connectivity we've created on a global scale, a small event in some faraway place in the world quickly cascades into an extreme disruptive event, leaving us scrambling to figure out what to do next. Dare I mention pandemic as just one example.
Right.
But I think that mounting performance pressure, the natural human reaction is fear. So it's understandable. I don't want to in any way suggest it's just craziness. No, there are reasons for the fear.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's a very limiting emotion. If we hold on to that emotion and let that drive our choices and actions, I believe it becomes a vicious cycle. The pressure mounts more and more, and we become more afraid, and it's an endless spiral.
Well, I think all of us can certainly relate to all of those things that you talked about in terms of things that we're dealing with, whether we're entrepreneurs or whether we're in the corporate world, personally and professionally. You know, the mounting competition is incessant.
Yeah.
You know, technology enabled the fact that the barriers to entry for most businesses are non-existent, and we're always trying to kind of keep our eyes and ears open. And there's that famous quote from Andy Grove from Intel that said, "Only the paranoid survive."
Right.
If you remember that one.
Oh yeah, no. And I think that I'll just highlight a paradox of the big shift, because as I mentioned, on one side, it's creating mounting performance pressure on all of us. At the same time, these same forces are creating exponentially expanding opportunity. We can create far more value with far less resource, far more quickly than would have been imaginable a few decades ago. But the problem is, if you're driven by fear, you can't even see those opportunities, much less have the motivation to pursue them. All you're focused on is the threat, the terrible things that are going to happen, and that squeezes you down. So I think that's the challenge, I believe, in the big shift, is how do we make the big shift in our psychology from fear to excitement and passion that will motivate us to really see and pursue the opportunities that are there.
Well, that obviously is the trick, right? And I certainly, only speaking for myself, sometimes some of that fear, that excitement, sometimes some of it, it converts from a threat to an opportunity once you've gone through a little bit of it, and some of that fear of the unknown, it becomes less unknown because you develop some confidence or some capability, or you get used to living outside of a comfort zone, and you know it's going to turn out okay. But I'm sure you've become more methodical about it. If you're living in that fear today, if someone is listening to this podcast, and we'll speak only maybe even professionally now, living in fear, what can they do about it? How do we move to that point where we see the future as full of opportunities instead of full of threats?
It's complicated. I don't want to suggest it's easy by any means. But partly I've made the journey, and I've worked with others to help them make the journey, and I've come to believe it can be done. It requires a fair amount of effort. First of all, just acknowledging the fear, because I think, at least in my experience, particularly most people are reluctant to even acknowledge they're afraid, because fear is a sign of weakness. You don't want to be afraid, you're a weakling. And they find other emotions to express the fear. The one that we're seeing around the world is anger. I'm angry. This is terrible. And, if you probe underneath the anger, it's being driven by fear. So I think the first step, again, is just looking within and recognizing that fear is an emotion that is shaping the choices and actions, both for yourself and for those around you in your organization. And recognizing, again, understandable, but limiting. So how do we move beyond it? And for me, the starting point, or one potential starting point for that journey, is to focus on what I call a personal narrative. And here I need to be careful because when I talk about narrative, everybody thinks I'm talking about stories. And I make a big distinction. So
Okay.
there's a bit of a detour. Stories for me are self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end to them. It's over, the end. And the story is about me, the storyteller, or it's about some other people, real or imagined. It's not about you. You can use your imagination, figure out what you would have done, but it's not about you. So in contrast, for me, a narrative is open-ended. There's some big threat or opportunity out in the future, not clear whether it's going to be achieved or not. And the resolution of the narrative hinges on you. It's a call to action to say your choices, your actions are going to help determine how this plays out. And so in that context, again, it's complicated. I'd make the distinction between threat-based narratives and opportunity-based narratives. I think increasingly we're being driven by threat-based narratives at all levels of our society and economy. And then there are different levels in the sense of, I believe we all have a personal narrative that we're living our lives to. There are corporate narratives, there are geographical narratives, there are movement narratives, but start with your personal narrative. And here I think it's a process of reflection, of just stepping back and saying, what is the narrative that is driving my life, that is shaping my choices and actions? When I look into the future, is it primarily threat or primarily opportunity? And I think more and more people are realizing that when they look into the future, it is a threatening future. It's a scary future. So that's the beginning, is to say, okay, that's what's shaping my emotion. How can I start to evolve my narrative so that I focus more on a big opportunity in the future that really could excite and inspire me and others? And do I have a call to action to others? I mean, am I asking for help in addressing this opportunity? If it's a threat-based narrative, typically, no, it's very isolating. You're just trying to do it all yourself. Versus if you can craft that opportunity-based narrative, you can start to inspire others to come together to help and join in addressing that opportunity. So I think just starting with that process, an internal process of reflection and evolution of your personal narrative, in my experience, can be very helpful in starting that to move beyond the fear.
So I'd like to come back, John, and talk about what we can do as leaders and what organizations can do with their narratives. But let's stay on the personal front. We could use me, you, or someone you know as an example. How is it we would look back into our history or our experience and what's taken place with us to take a look at that narrative to change if I'm caught in feeling that the future is full of threats? How is it I look back, and I know you're not a psychologist or anything of that nature, but any advice for those listening on, what you've been through or others have been through?
No, again, it's complicated. It varies by person in terms of what's really going to be most helpful and effective. But in my experience, it's not looking back, it's looking ahead.
Okay.
And really trying to say, what is the future? And is it just threat? Is that all there is in the future? Is that what's the dominant thing? Or are there in fact opportunities? One thing, if you want to look back, one thing to look back on is where and when in my life did I get excited about something? Really excited and passionate about pursuing something, and starting to see if there's a pattern there. If there are certain things that all those experiences combine to define an opportunity that you could pursue in the future that would be really exciting. That's the start of the journey, for sure.
Well, it's interesting. Even what I would see as the most pessimistic, of people that I have met, when you ask them a question like, what are you passionate about? They may not be passionate about work, but they've got a hobby, or they've got a portion of their life or their family or something they're extremely passionate about. And then you see everything change for them,
Yeah.
when they start to describe it and they start to speak of it. And I think for most of us running companies or leading people today, we'd love to have teams of people that engaged about what we do. How
Yeah, I want to be a little bit cautious here again, because passion is a key theme in my book. But again, it's a word that, in my experience, if I'm in a workshop and ask participants to define passion, I'll get a different definition from each person. So we all
Yeah,
use the same word, but we all have different meanings. What's
right.
passion? And for me, I'm focused on a very specific form of passion that came from research looking at environments where there's sustained extreme performance improvement. And it's what I call passion of the explorer. And what I mean by that is it's a passion where you are driven and excited about having more and more impact in a specific area, specific domain. And that you're excited when you're confronted by challenges. Challenges are exciting because they're an opportunity to have even more impact. In fact, you seek out the challenges. You don't just wait for them to happen. And then you also, if you have the passionate explorer, you're very much a connector. When you confront one of these passions, one of these challenges, your first reaction is, who else can I connect with who can help me get to a better answer faster? So they're extremely connected. And I think the problem, I'm going to generalize here, and I think it particularly applies to larger companies and organizations in general, not just companies, but large organizations around the world. Passion is deeply suspect. Passionate people ask too many questions. Passionate people take too many risks. They deviate from the script. They're not just performing the assigned tasks. And again, when I talk to senior executives and ask them if they want passion in their workers, they say, of course. But what they mean by passion for them, it's people who work nights and weekends on the assigned tasks, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's a passionate person, without questions, without taking any risk, doing the assigned tasks. And so again, I think that's the challenge, is we have organizations that are hostile to passion. And as you said, you find it at home and in hobbies and things outside the work environment, because I think we all have a desire for passion.
I wonder if that's bred into us through our education.
Oh, yes.
Right. I don't know if, and I'm certainly no teacher, certainly my older brother's a teacher, but I'm wondering if some of the school systems are set up where we want everybody to do things exactly as we tell them to do them. And if you are passionate or enthusiastic or energetic, those things are kind of quelled because they're disruptive. I wonder if maybe we learn to leave a little bit of that passion at the door.
No, one of the pushbacks I get from people when I talk about passion is, oh, come on, John, some of us are capable of passion, but most of us just want to be told what to do and have the security of an income.
Wow.
And my response to that is, okay, let's go to a playground and let's look at children 5 or 6 years old. Show me one that's not really excited about exploring and taking risk and coming together with others to experience new things. We all had that as children, but to your point, what happened? We went to school and we were told by the teacher to just listen to the teacher, memorize what the teacher has to say, and show you've memorized it on the exams.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's understandable in the sense that schools are preparing us for the organizations that are out there that we're going to work in, that are hostile to passion and that want you to just do the assigned task.
Right.
Efficiently and quickly. And so I think that that's the problem and challenge we have, is our school system is and our larger our institutions in general are squashing the passion. And yet passion is a really powerful emotion that can help us to really see the opportunities and pursue the opportunities. and overcome the fear.
If I walked into an organization I was consulting with or working with today, John, and noticed some of these things, how could I, and I know it's complicated and takes time, but what are some of the things I'm going to think about to try and change that over time, where I want to make it, and again, I know this is an overused term, but I want to make it, a safe place, a psychologically safe place for people to do their best work while still being held accountable for results, because we're all held accountable for results.
Right.
As CEOs listening to this, what are some of the things they should be thinking about?
Well, one of the things that I recommend, and it's challenging for sure. I believe that we are in institutions today where the mark of a strong leader is someone who has an answer to all the questions. No matter what question, you can count on the leader to have an answer. And by the way, if they don't have an answer, maybe it's time to get rid of them and find somebody who does.
Uh-oh.
And I think it's the reason why trust is eroding in our leadership, because there are two possibilities in that situation. One is the leader has no clue how rapidly the world is changing and how much uncertainty there is, or they're lying. In either case, why would I trust them as a leader?
Right.
I think, to your point about how do we start to shift the culture in an organization, I think one thing leaders can do is start to ask powerful, inspiring questions. How could we do this? What could we do to accomplish this? And ask for help. First of all, admit they don't have an answer and ask for help in finding an answer. But it sends a powerful message to the organization. Number one, the questions are not only allowed, but necessary, and that it's fine to say you don't have an answer and ask for help. And I think spreading that throughout the organization. And then I think to your point about measuring results or performance, it's being clear about what are the metrics in terms of what answers come up. How could we measure the value or progress of those answers? And so focusing people on metrics in terms of how are we going to make the progress can be very helpful.
That what a great point about when a leader today appears as if they have the answer to every question out there. If you're listening to that, you either don't believe them. So I don't believe them. So now my trust is eroded. I think it's so true. And I think it speaks to there's this need for authenticity or vulnerability to a certain extent, in leaders where they'll admit it. And if you're part of that team and a leader comes to the table and says, I'm actually not sure what the answer is, I don't know what it is, but you feel more compelled to try and help and weigh in and lean in. Whereas if you're sitting in the room being told what to do all the time, you're starting to wonder, why wasn't I engaged or asked for my opinion? I've got some expertise and some thoughts and some things I can contribute here. I wonder why no one asked me. And I always, of course, all roads sort of lead to Rome with the Selling Well podcast, which is, everything we've talked about is so incredibly relevant for sales leadership and professional selling in general. Where that authenticity, asking the questions, people don't go into sales because they want to be told what to do. They actually are mini entrepreneurs who want to run their business and think they know what to do. And it's this trick of how do we coach and how do we help lead? Who's doing this well out there these days corporately, John? Is there anybody you like the look of without, just using examples where they've created either a culture or an environment, that enables folks to be psychologically safe and do their best work? Any examples in the public domain that we can share?
I wish I had some good examples, but I think, especially for large companies, it's very hard to see anyone as a leader who's asking hard questions and saying, I don't have an answer. And it's challenging. I think that, again, part of the reason I'm in Silicon Valley is because the entrepreneurs, the smaller companies, organizations have this passion, and leaders are constantly asking questions. I have to say, well, it's but the problem is, as they get bigger, the investors start to say, well, you need adult supervision, is the phrase.
Right.
And what they mean is bring in some experienced senior executives from larger companies who can help you to scale the business. And what they do is they help you to scale the business by crushing that passion and by focusing everybody on the assigned tasks, doing everything fast and cheap. And, so it's a transition that I've seen, unfortunately, many times. And I think is a real challenge, is how do we preserve that passion that drove us in the early days to create a wonderful business.
That evolution, obviously, you've seen it so many more times than me, given your experience and your time in Silicon Valley. But we're based in Toronto. We have a wonderful, tech environment, entrepreneurial sort of community here, and many of my clients. I'm actually in the board meetings with the clients as a temporary head of sales, going through those. I see exactly what you're referencing, and in some cases, these boards think that their job is to kind of contain or rein in this entrepreneurial CEO who's got the vision and the drive, and actually, does lead people. That's how they get these companies off the ground. You want to follow this person. You want to collaborate with this person. It's so exciting because it is contagious. Their view of the future and the opportunity is so exciting. You want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I'll also just throw in, I think, again, it's part of this transition or evolution to cultivate more passion and different cultures in organizations. I'm a strong proponent of, back to narrative, what I call corporate narratives. And here, the challenge is when I talk about corporate narratives, people think, oh, we have a corporate narrative. We started in a garage. We faced incredible obstacles. We overcame them, accomplished amazing things. That's our narrative. And my pushback is, that's about you. That's about your past. What about your customers, the people you're trying to reach outside your organization? What's the big opportunity for them, inspiring opportunity in the future? Back to narrative, something in the future. And what's the call to action to the customers to address that opportunity? And the example I like to give, it's unfortunately one of the few examples I know of, but again, back to Silicon Valley, it was Apple Computer back in the 1990s, which had a narrative condensed into the slogan of "Think Different."
Yeah.
But if you unpack that slogan, it was, for decades we had digital technology that took away our names, gave us numbers, put us in cubicles. Now, for the first time, there's a generation of technology that can allow us to express our unique potential and individuality. But it's not going to happen automatically. You need to think different. Will you think different? And I think it's the reason why, for many people, Apple became the equivalent of a religion. It spoke to such a deep aspiration that people had at the time. And so I think it's a powerful way to generate passion within a company, because you're now focused on an opportunity for the customers that is really exciting and inspiring. And it creates a framework or context to start to ask some powerful questions. I mean, as a leader, once you have the opportunity identified, there are a whole bunch of questions about how do we get there? How do we help customers to address that opportunity? And that excites people.
Well, actually, I'm smiling, John, for those listening, because I might have this wrong, but I have this vision in my mind of that Apple commercial about Think Different. And I think if I remember this correctly, it had a very, think of it as a 1984 type of environment where there were workers almost chained to cubicles, very dark, very dingy, a lot of fear.
Yep.
And what happened was an incredibly muscular individual went running down the center of an aisle and had like a hammer, like Thor's hammer, an amulet, and threw it at a screen where this 1984 figure was telling everybody what to do.
Yeah.
And it smashed the screen. And then the commercial went to color.
Yeah.
And suddenly everything came alive. And I think that's where they rolled out Think Different.
Well, it certainly was a key part of their campaign, and I think it's a great lesson to companies, because I think so many companies today are just talking about themselves and the great products they have. And the interesting thing in Think Different was that Apple was virtually not even mentioned. It was all about the customer and what they could do, what they needed to do. And yes, Apple had some products that could help people think different, but that was in the background. It was all about the customer and what the opportunity was for them.
Well, it has to be all about them. At the beginning, you mentioned, one of the challenges you'd had when, with these incredible credentials with BCG and McKinsey and Deloitte, working with clients, coming up with spectacular strategies that were never implemented because they didn't emotionally connect with the people who had to execute on them. On the other side of the fence, if we as businesses don't emotionally connect with the better futures that our clients and prospects want, they're never going to, as much as the business case might make sense and the math might make sense, they won't move forward either.
Yeah.
And ironically, it's the same thing. It's fear that prevents them.
Yes.
It's exactly the same thing, because on the one hand, you start to, and this is a great sales author, Matt Dixon's come up with this in his latest book called The Jolt Effect. But salespeople go in pitching and talking about things saying, we've got something better than the status quo. And they create fear of missing out. So your status quo is not good enough. We've got something better. And it's easy to get people excited usually for that.
Mm-hmm.
But then to move forward, particularly with things like enterprise software that are a major commitment, that same buyer starts to have the fear of the future. Because did I make the right decision? Are we going to achieve the business outcomes that we talked about? Is this company actually going to implement on time and on budget? And the reality of it is that fear becomes paralyzing, and they'd rather miss out than mess up. And those are Matt's terms. But because if I make a decision, all the lights are on me now, and I made a decision. If I just quietly keep my head down and do nothing, it's so much easier on me.
Right. Absolutely.
Fear of the future. So this is where these things come into play in terms of our particular discipline. Given your amazing background, John, I have to ask this question. So you've done so much high-level, extremely complex strategy work for some of the largest organizations in the world. And then when you went to Deloitte, you created this Center for the Edge. Tell me, first of all, before I get to my question, what prompted that? What's the Edge?
Well, I was recruited into Deloitte with the promise that I could set up my own research center and have autonomy within Deloitte. And so they asked me what would I want as the focus of this research center. And for me, and this has been my passion throughout most of my life, is how do we look ahead and see opportunities that we didn't know existed before, and not just anticipate the opportunity, but act on the opportunity. So the charter for the Center for the Edge was identify emerging opportunities that should be on the CEO's agenda, but are not, and do the research to persuade them to put it on the agenda. So that was kind of the catalyst and focus of the Center for the Edge. And yeah, it was a great journey and experience to help anticipate those opportunities.
I can see the joy of the process on your face on the camera, just talking about it. You were so excited. So now we lead to just my question about strategy. And one of the things that seems so challenging these days, when I'm sitting at someone's executive table with a small group of leaders for the business, is developing that strategy moving forward. And you see some organizations that have this clear picture of who they are, but what they want to be to clients. They really don't spend a lot of time or effort thinking about the competitive environment, going against Michael Porter from years back. But they just believe the closer they are to the client, they're going to help them work collaboratively to the future. You see other organizations that are trying to anticipate everything that could happen. But the problem, as you aptly pointed out, in terms of the things that drive fear right now, there's so many things that could happen. Hedging your bets can't be a strategy because there's just too many things that could come at you.
Right.
Counsel, what do we do?
I've become a strong proponent of a different approach to strategy than most traditional companies pursue. And it comes from my experience working with some of the most successful tech companies in Silicon Valley. They have an approach to strategy that I've come to call zoom out, zoom in. And what I mean by that is they focus on two different time horizons in parallel. One time horizon, 10 to 20 years. Zoom out. And the questions on that horizon are, what is our relevant market or industry going to look like 10 to 20 years from now? And what's a really big opportunity that could be much larger than anything we've ever done before?
Oh, great.
So that's the zoom out. Zoom in is different horizon, 6 to 12 months. And on that horizon, the questions are, what are the 2 or 3 initiatives, no more, that we could pursue over the next 6 to 12 months that would have the greatest impact in accelerating our movement towards that longer term opportunity?
Oh, great.
And do we have a critical mass of resource against those 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? And how would we measure progress? And so it's an interesting balance of zoom out, long-term opportunity, but short-term action and impact. And I think for many reasons, I think this is a very powerful approach to strategy, but I'll go back to emotions. In my view, this strategy is most helpful in addressing the emotion of fear, because on the one side, it focuses on a really big, inspiring opportunity out in the future, long term, but recognizing that people with fear are just going to be dismissive and skeptical and say, that's never going to happen. That's just a fantasy. Focusing on the short-term action in the next 6 to 12 months, where you can demonstrate real progress and impact towards that opportunity. Now, all of a sudden, the people who are driven by fear are saying, oh my God, you're able to do that in the next in the 6 months? How can I join? How can I become part of this? And so I think it's a very helpful way of pulling people out of their fear and into excitement and passion about an opportunity.
There's a spectacular clip, Thomas and Aritzia, for the beginning of the podcast, zoom in, zoom out. I just love that one. And let me ask you this, John. So you're just such an established author. We're going to talk a little bit about a couple of the other books you've written. Today's discussion was on the journey beyond fear. Leverage the 3 pillars of positivity to build your success. What are you reading right now? So what are your sources of information? Which authors are you enjoying right now? Obviously, you're a lifelong learner. What other things are you reading right now? What do you like?
Boy, I read so many things. I have a hard time capturing the titles or the authors. I focus on things that are
what topics?
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with technology in the future. So how is technology evolving in ways that could change the future? And looking at it again from through an opportunity lens. And on the other side, it's looking at history. I've spent a lot of time actually studying history just to understand what is it that motivated people to really pursue opportunities and innovate, and what is it that held them back at different points in history. And so I'm constantly in a learning mindset. I think that no matter how much I've read, there's so much more to learn, and just want to keep learning.
Well, it's one of the joys of life, and it can be one of the professional joys of your profession, if you can embrace that. That lifelong learning mentality. And I love this idea of just all of us taking a breath and realizing there's no expectation that we know everything. We don't. I'll give the answer to that one. We don't know everything. If I'm talking to someone like you with your background and your credentials, and you're still learning, believe me, I think everybody on this podcast needs to continue that lifelong journey. I'll share one thing I'm enjoying at the moment. I know you spent time with the University.
Singularity.
Yeah. Peter
Yes.
Diamandis and company. And
yes.
One of his most recent books with his teammate, whose name escapes me, I apologize to his teammate, but it's "The Future is Faster Than You Think." And if you want to get excited about the future and the convergence of certain technologies like quantum computing, with big data, with advances in medicine, it is shocking the things that are taking place and how exciting the future really is.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the theme of learning, because I think it's been central to the work that I've done. But the phrase lifelong learning has become a
catchphrase
in every company and every organization. But the challenge is when I press the leaders on, okay, so what's the motivation for lifelong learning? That takes a lot of effort. That's very. And the response I get from leaders, well, if they don't do lifelong learning, they're going to lose their jobs. So get with it, start learning. Fear. And while I think fear can be a bit of a motivator for learning, people who have this passion of the explorer are driven to learn. They're excited about the learning. They're constantly learning. And if they can't learn fast enough in your organization, they're going to go find somebody else, someplace else where they can learn faster. But they're excited about it. And I think that's, again, one of the reasons that I'm so focused on how do we cultivate more of this passion of the explorer in the workforce, because that's the way we'll get true lifelong learning.
Well, John, everybody listening to this podcast today, I think, is going to rush out and buy at least one of your books. They should, by the way. Those books, gang: The Journey Beyond Fear, Leverage the 3 Pillars of Positivity to Build Your Success. Prior to that, The Power of Pull, How Smart Moves, Smartly Made, Can Set Big Things in Motion. And The Only Sustainable Edge, Why Business Strategy Depends on Productive Friction. And Dynamic Specialization. That's just a few of the publications from John. He's also got an extremely active blog post that everybody's going to want to check out. All of the links to John's website and LinkedIn page, of course, will be in the show notes for today's show. John, I would just like to thank you very sincerely for joining us today. It's been an amazing pleasure speaking to you.
Well, it was a rich conversation. I appreciate your interest, for sure.
Folks, I'd like to thank you as well for joining today. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please like and subscribe to the Selling Well podcast. Tell your friends. And by the way, we're lifelong learners. I know it's a catchphrase, but we're lifelong learners at the Selling Well. So if there's some way that we can make this investment in your time more productive for you, please let us know. You can email me directly, markcox@inthefunnel.com. That's my email, and I check that email. Give us your constructive criticism. We'll be delighted to try and to continue to improve. And in the meantime, we'll see everybody next time, and thank you again for joining.